Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm back with the hormone series that I said I was going to do for you guys. And I'm going to start with the teen brain, so adolescence and hormones. So have your kids lost their minds to their hormones? It's something we hear all the time, right? What's wrong with kids these days? I mean, you hear it in so many different ways. And there's a reason for that. I mean, kids go through this major change in adolescence. It's like when they're 2 years old and then again when they're adolescent, right? So why? Why do they go through this major change? Well, as you might have suspected, and why I'm doing this, it turns out it's not just their hormones. So it has a lot to do with their brains. In fact, what affects a kid's brain affects their, how do I say this? Hormones affect brains, which affect hormones, okay? So especially in the teenage years. So a teen's brain affects their hormones, which affects their brain. It happens at every stage in life, but it just so happens that during the teen years, you have these major surges in hormones. So let's take a look at what's going on during the teen years. Now, I'm not a hormone expert. I just happen to take a very personal interest in this because of my own issues with my hormones, which caused me to do a lot of research and have some great mentors. And I can, leave the names of a couple of great hormone experts at the end of the talk if you'd like. So what causes this? We have these major changes in surges in hormones that go on during adolescence. You've got stress hormones like adrenal stress hormones, sex hormones, growth hormones, oxytocin, which is a bonding hormone. You then have an increase in testosterone. In fact, testosterone in boys goes up 10 times during adolescence. So they get this radical shift in their testosterone, which not only increases, obviously, their sex drive, but their motivation. Their tendencies towards aggression, things like that can change during that time. Estrogen surges. So in girls, here's the difference with boys and girls. Boys get this regular, onslaught of testosterone, whereas girls get these cyclical changes and surges in estrogen, which is a big problem for some girls. So that's what makes girls very much more vulnerable to depression. We'll talk about why in a second. And then you've got dopamine, and one of the big ones I want to talk about today, believe it or not, is melatonin. Melatonin cycles change during adolescence. So your kid's not lazy. Their melatonin cycles are changing, all right? This major pruning process goes on in the brain. So now the brain's beginning to prune and become more specialized and develop, and so your kids can focus better on the things they need to focus on. And their rational brains are actually pretty well developed by the time they're 15 or 16, but their emotional brain is not. So there's this uneven development. So if you ask a kid, what is the right thing to do in certain situations? If you ask them and sit there and question them, they'll tell you the right things to do. I know this is right, I know this is wrong. But put them in that situation and put pressure on them. They become easily overwhelmed because of all of these hormonal and brain changes going on at the same time. And their frontal lobes are not developed. Their emotional brain is not finished developing. So now they become easily overwhelmed, and their emotional brains aren't able to process it all very easily. And even though they can verbalize what the right thing is to do when there's no pressure, when there is pressure, they suddenly don't do the right thing. And later they're not quite sure why. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. So it has to do with that rational brain versus emotional brain and that tendency because of this pruning and reshaping. That pruning and reshaping will have an effect on hormones, while hormones also have an effect on that pruning and reshaping. Now, a lot of it has to do with genetics and vulnerabilities. I'm not going into all that. This is very general. But you can be more susceptible during that time to certain vulnerabilities depending on your family history or genes, things like that. So let's go to the next page here. The effects of brain changes during adolescence. What are the effects of some of these changes during adolescence? Well, this is a time that kids are more prone to accidental death, homicide, suicide, binge drinking and doing drugs, risk-taking behaviors. So doing things that get them into big trouble, conflict seeking, depression, and addictions. Really interestingly, because of what I was just talking about with the pruning and the surge in dopamine, but the brain not being fully developed yet, adolescents, not kids, adolescents need more stimulation in their pleasure and reward center to feel the same thing that an adult feels. So I hope that made sense. They need more stimulation to feel the same thing. So that's sometimes why they engage in risk-taking behaviors. Plus, their frontal lobes aren't fully developed. So That's a big part of that dopamine, some of their neurotransmitters and hormones with that brain reshaping. Here's an interesting thing. Sex hormones, okay, testosterone and estrogen especially, have a big effect on serotonin and dopamine. So you can have this effect on dopamine, which is your risk and reward and motivation neurotransmitter, but especially girls who are going through these cyclical changes in their estrogen surges, that can be a problem when it comes to serotonin, because estrogen surges actually can decrease the availability of serotonin receptors. Now that was kind of complicated, but basically, in a nutshell, when you get big estrogen surges, it can, depending on, it's individual for every person, but it can diminish the availability that your body has of being having access to serotonin, which is your don't worry, be happy neurotransmitter. It can make you more vulnerable to depression and mood swings and things like that. We all know girls are vulnerable to mood swings during those times, right? But it's worse during adolescence for a lot of people. So that's what I'm talking about here. Decreases serotonin receptor availability. And then we talked about the rational brain versus the emotional brain. So the brain actually develops sort of from the back coming forward. So coordination develops first. They learn to walk. They can rationalize. They know right from wrong. But do they do the right thing from the wrong thing? Let's try and say that again. And they need more stimulation than an adult does to feel the same things. So now you can see where they can get themselves into some trouble, right? But here's a really, really interesting thing that I want you to take away from this, because it's something not a lot of people really talk about, and that is the teen brain and sleep. So during teenage years and adolescence, melatonin cycles, the release of melatonin at night, like melatonin's released and it makes you tired. And for most adults, it happens, at certain times. It's your circadian rhythm. Well, for teens, that melatonin cycle is delayed. Melatonin gets released later. So they're not tired. They become night owls. They want to stay up all night. And, people are like, oh my gosh, teens are so annoying. They want to stay up all night. What is it with that? That's what it is. It's actually biological. And just when they finally get to sleep, guess what? It's time to wake up and go to school. And they've still got melatonin being released. Their melatonin surge is still going on while you're trying to wake the dead and get them out the door to go to school. Now, how effective do you think you're going to be if you weren't able? You can make them go to bed at 10 if you want, but that's sort of a waste. They'll lay there and stare at the ceiling because they're not able to usually go to sleep. And then you wake them up when they're tired, leaves them vulnerable to a whole bunch of stuff. So there's a really good book called Nurture Shock. I love the book called Nurture Shock. And they talk about this thing called the lost hour. They actually did an experiment where they had some schools around the country start school later, like at least an hour later. Some schools were a little later than that even, but at least an hour later, because they called that the lost hour, where kids weren't getting enough sleep and it was making them vulnerable to all sorts of problems. If you know my husband and I and what we talk about, we talk all the time about the importance of sleep on the brain and on health and on decision making. Well, you've got a teenager who already struggles with decision making, and now they can't get enough sleep, and this is a problem. And some of them get up extra early to go to school for sports practice. So guess what? It increases the risk of car accidents. It affects their SAT scores. Or I said car accidents, didn't I? But when they did this, the lost hour, when they had these schools, there were a couple of schools in particular. One was in Minnesota, and one was actually in Lexington, Kentucky, and a couple really interesting things happened. SAT scores went up pretty dramatically. Math scores went up by 56 points, and their verbal scores went up by 156 points on their SAT scores. Car accidents, teen car accidents. Teens are responsible for over 100,000 accidents per year from falling asleep at the wheel. Car accidents went down by 25% in that town when they started school later. And so it was car accidents, SAT scores, but what really changed was their mood, depression, irritability, focus, impulse control, their ability to make better decisions. They reported being happier and not as depressed. Judgment, willpower, and even things like weight changed because they could make better decisions. And their other hormones were more balanced when you get more sleep. So your brain has time to clean itself. So sleep is so critically important. Sometimes when you wonder why your teen is being such a pill, take these things into consideration. I'm not saying to give them an excuse, But I am saying take it into consideration because they matter. You can fight biology all you want and be miserable, or you can at least understand it and start making it work for you. So what can you do? Number one, educate your teens. Educate your teens and get involved in maybe, sports teams in schools and see what you can do about helping your teens get better sleep. And listen to them. You have to listen to them and remember what it was like. I'm sorry, but my friends, I have certain friends who I love dearly, and they'll talk to me about how, they're talking to their kids and they'll tell their kids about how great they were when they were their age and they didn't make bad decisions. And I look at them and my jaw hits the table and I'm like, wait a minute. I was there. Like, I remember I didn't make great decisions and you most certainly did not. So, I think when we can, create some bonding and empathy and be honest with our kids and don't tell them that you did certain things so that you give them permission. Actually do the opposite. Tell them you did certain things because you don't want them to make the same mistakes, because it wasn't very smart, because you understand, because you're creating a bridge. But when you make them think that it's them and you don't understand and you were this perfect kid, you don't do anything to increase trust. Nothing. So listen and remember, firm and kind. That doesn't mean just because you're listening and you understand that you give them permission to go be snots. Okay, that's not the point. Firm and kind. You explain why these are the boundaries, these are the limits, this is what's going to happen. If you don't do what you need to do, what we need you to do, my job is to keep you safe. My job is to get you, through college and help you be a responsible adult. I love you. I don't want to ruin your fun. I'm also going to make sure you come out of this thing alive if I have anything to do with it. Here's what we need to do. These are my limits. And you explain the consequences, but you have to be willing to let them pay the consequences, and most parents are not. My experience, most parents talk a good game, but they're not willing to let kids pay the consequences when the rubber hits the road. And you have to be willing to do that. My daughter actually looked at me. I've never laid a hand on her. My daughter looked at me and we have so much fun. She's like one of my very best friends. And she looked at me one day and she goes, "You scare the crap out of me." She did say that word. But I thought it was hilarious because I'm like, why would I scare you? I've never done anything to scare you. She goes, "I don't even know how to explain it." She goes, "I can tell you anything. I totally trust you, but I know that if I do certain things, I know there's hell to pay." So, it's a limit. I don't have to say it. It's just, she knows what my limits are. And I'm very clear. I tell her the rules. This happens and we're coming home early. This happens, you're not going. This happens and I don't do things for kids who treat me that way. So you just have to be very clear and use your biology, use their biology, don't fight it. So if you're going to try and fight biology, I'd like for you to tell me when that's ever worked in the history of the universe. I mean, stories, poetry, movies are made about kids' biology, and the conflict between parents and kids. In the history of the universe, that has never worked. So I'm going to encourage you not to do that and use their biology in your favor. Explain to them that you understand. Explain to them why you're saying the things you're saying, that you're not trying to ruin their fun. But these are adult consequences. You make adult decisions and you don't trust me enough to help you, then I can't help you pay the consequences. Those are consequences you get to pay all by yourself. Things like STD and teen pregnancy and all sorts of things. You got to be honest. But use their biology also in a positive way. In other words, they do have this really need for, this big need for risk and reward. Like they have a stronger drive for risky behavior and fun. They need fun and excitement. Use that. I do like really fun, sort of outrageous things with my daughter all the time. So she ends up thinking I'm sort of cool, right? But I do it in a safe environment. I'm able to set the stage for her to learn safe ways to do that, number one. And also, I teach her the reward for doing things the right way, because the reward center is also, in addition to the need for stimulation, their reward center, that's part of it. That reward center is tied to that need for stimulation. So we do really safe things. I'm constantly stimulating that with her in a positive way, but then I teach her the rewards for doing it the right way. I'm clear about the boundaries, but she gets major reward, for doing things in a really positive, healthy way. So she can learn that you can have fun in a safe way. It doesn't have to be a drag. Hopefully that makes sense. So, hands-on parents, really interesting study from Columbia University, said that hands-on parents decreased the risk of substance abuse in their teens by 25%. When you're a hands-on parent, you're honest, you create a bond with your kids. By the way, their oxytocin is also up. That's their bonding hormone. So you can create really good bonds if you do the right things at this stage, if you're open to them and you listen to what is important to them. Don't try and make it about what's important to you. Make it about what's important to them and get involved in what they want to do, even if it's boring to you. But hands-on parents, have dinner at the table, things like that, decreases the risk of substance abuse by 25%. So I know that was a lot. This is a little longer than usual. I hope it was helpful. Would love your feedback. Share this if it was useful to you. And the next go around, we're going to talk about more about hormones. I'll surprise you about what it's going to be. Thanks a lot. Have a great weekend, rest of your weekend.